Good evening. The subject for this lecture is Latin America. Which way now? We have seen some changes in Latin American politics, but these changes may not be permanent. In fact, probably will not be permanent, but the whole region is fraught with great instability and danger. In this lecture, I will discuss briefly 4 Latin American cases, 4 Latin American countries from the south of the border of the United States, that is Mexico, to the southern cone, Argentina. So from Mexico to Argentina, we will go through Venezuela and Brazil. Now Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina are relatively larger economies than Venezuela. Many people think that Venezuela is a very large economy because it has oil, but that is simply not true, and it will become clear when I give some economic data on each of these countries. So without further ado, let's begin with Mexico. Mexico is the second largest export market for the US. Many may remember the old saying by some Mexican, I think. It is that Mexico, so far from God, so close to the US. Well, being close to the US certainly has led to a very complicated situation for Mexico. I'm speaking from Colorado, and people who have read history realize that prior to 1846, a large chunk of Colorado actually belonged to Mexico, and everything south of that chunk also belonged to Mexico, all the way through Texas. And California also belonged at one time to Mexico. So there is that history, the history of the land grab, which we don't need to go into to understand what's going on in Mexico today. The proximity to the US is a big factor. Mexico has become the second largest export market for the US. The two-way trade between Mexico and United States is over $500 billion today. But Mexican economy has been anemic at best. The great hype about NAFTA, that it would lead to great mutual benefits for both countries, in particular Mexico, has not come true. And many of us were skeptical even at that time. The worst has not come true either. There was a candidate for a while in US presidential elections named Ross Perot, who talked about a giant sucking sound, meaning that Mexico will suck American resources and American people would be much worse off. That hasn't happened, but for Mexico, things have turned for the worse, definitely. With the possible exception of maquiladoras and some jobs created there, some investment attracted to the northern part of Mexico, that is close to the US, and a bit in Mexico City. Mexico hasn't gotten much out of it. On the contrary, the ejido system, such as it was in Mexico, has been completely destroyed. Mexican agriculture beyond ejido has also been almost completely demolished, so that artificially the Mexican agriculture is less than 4% of Mexican economy today. As a country develops, of course, agricultural sector shrinks because industrial sector develops. But in case of Mexico, it is not a story of industrial sector developing either. It is mostly a story of a service sector and a tremendous unemployment, which has led to the kind of flow of workers from the south to the north, south being Mexico in this case. To give you a few more statistics, the growth rate of Mexico has been anemic at best, less than 1.2%. The savings ratio is 21%, which is not too bad, but still it's not the savings rate of a tiger. Investment likewise is low. It is really less than 25%, and with a labor force that is indeed quite large, running up to more than 50 million people. It has a tremendous amount of inequality. The Gini index is in the vicinity of 0.48. It has a debt that is lower than it was during the debt crisis, but it's still approximately $360 billion. And exchange rate of peso, of course, is never very stable, but it has seen a slight move downwards, which should technically improve their export performance, but it really hasn't. The politics of Mexico, of course, illustrates that phrase, so far from God. Although they have this three-party pact for reform, there isn't much on the agenda for reform in Mexico. And on top of everything else, we have the regional disparities in Mexico, the problem of indigenous peoples, of which Chiapas is really the tip of the iceberg, as the cliche goes. So Mexico faces a very uncertain future. And basically, Mexican ruling class relies on the US to fix things up for them, even if the cost is enormous. The neoliberal program in Mexico has created some surprising millionaires and billionaires, especially people like Carlos Slim, who have looted the state sector, in this case telecom in particular, to build their wealth. So this is not really an example of entrepreneurship, but really of crony capitalism, even in a more devastating way than it was prior to 1980s in Mexico. So Mexico is a country that still is very far from God and very far from solving people's problems. It is an economy that will be unstable in the foreseeable future. It is a polity that will be unstable and will become progressively more unstable. That is the prognosis we can make. On the other hand, the forces for progress in Mexico are yet disorganized. People like Castañeda, who was in the government at one time and is a darling of US imperialism, identifies what he calls the good left, the left that is willing to collaborate with US imperialism, and the bad left, people who actually don't want US imperialism, who want more popular democracy, who want resources to be distributed down below, and for indigenous resources to remain indigenous. This is the bad left for people like Castañeda. But ideas are there, many good ideas. Organizations are fragmentary, so there is a tremendous political problem of collective action from below with a progressive agenda. But the best hope for Mexico and Mexican people lies really in that direction. Better organization of people across Mexico with a better program and more militant action and consistent political steps. Undoubtedly, the global capitalism is in crisis, and Mexican capitalism is in even a deeper crisis than the rest of the world. And collaboration with US imperialism is not going to solve the problems of the Mexican people, regardless of who wins the presidential election in the US. So that is not the last word, but my word for Mexico for the time being. Now let's turn to Venezuela. Venezuela, of course, had its own popular revolution with all the flaws that one can easily point out. Chavez actually did indicate that the so-called 21st century socialism requires at least two things. On the one hand, it requires the national control of national resources, most particularly oil, in case of Venezuela. On the other hand, and even more importantly, a socialist program for the 21st century needs to prepare the people from below, to organize them. And it is the organization of ordinary people, the workers especially, as well as the unemployed, in neighborhoods, in barrios, that really saved Chavez from a coup that was carefully planned by the elite in Venezuela and with active collaboration from CIA in the US, and also right-wing regional elements, for example, from Colombia. But Venezuelan economy has suffered from decline in oil prices, and although its per capita income remains in the neighborhood of $13,000 to $14,000, not far from the Mexican per capita income of $15,000 to $16,000, and its growth rate is slightly higher at 1.6% than Mexico. It really has seen a tremendous decline from the days when growth rate was 6% or higher even. Venezuelan savings is still higher in percentage term than Mexico. It is about 25%, and the labor force is smaller than Mexico, of course, 14.01 million people. But inflation is much higher, greater than 40%, and their Gini coefficient is lower than Mexico, in the neighborhood of 0.39. It used to be much higher, and the period of flawed socialism, but socialism nevertheless, has meant a redistribution in favor of the poorer elements of the society, and therefore Gini coefficient has come down from being above 0.4 to near 0.4, a little below 0.4, 0.39 to be exact. Venezuela's trade actually is in surplus. Their exports recently were recorded at about $92 billion and imports at $60 billion. Of course, a lot of their revenues came from oil, and going down of the oil prices has meant a fall in revenue. But they still have a budget surplus, and their debt is not that high. So there is plenty of play, even economically, for Venezuela, although people have to tighten their belts. The main problem of Venezuela is political. With the reversal in the parliament recently, and constant barrage of propaganda against Maduro and his government, and hardly a day goes by when the opposition newspapers don't speak of Maduro and his government in contemptuous terms. It is actually almost a miracle that Venezuela is still maintaining some semblance of social democracy and political stability, to the eternal shame of Washington Post. That newspaper ran an op-ed not so long ago, basically inviting other right-wing Latin American countries to intervene in Venezuela. If we can think of imperialism by proxy, one could not find a clearer example of this than the Washington Post op-ed. So what will happen in Venezuela is very fraught. On the one hand, you have this class conflict within the country, which has now sharpened in the form of political conflict within the state. So we will definitely see a lot more battles for the hearts and minds of Venezuelan people. We will see a lot of fights in the media. We will see also probably a lot of fights on the street. And it wouldn't be unusual for a coup to occur at some point either. Direct intervention by the US is less likely, although it can't be ruled out. It all depends on the intensity of the problems as they shape up. Right now, Venezuela can still solve its constitutional crisis within the framework of the constitution that they have. And people in Venezuela are much better organized than they have been at any previous point in their recent history. Therefore, popular power in Venezuela, to the extent that it exists, will not be surrendered without a fight. So that is my prognosis for Venezuela. Let's now turn to Brazil, which is the largest economy in Latin America. At the purchasing power parity prices, Brazilian economy in 2015 was measured at $3.166 trillion. So that is much larger than Mexican and Venezuelan economies combined. In fact, double the size of those two economies combined. But the same Brazilian economy in constant dollars was $3.265 trillion in 2014, which means that Brazil has a negative growth rate of 3%. And GDP per capita is still middle income country range, 15,800, similar to Mexico and Venezuela. Their savings rate, however, is much lower than either of these countries at 14%. Their investment is only 17.6%, and they also have a high rate of inflation. Their labor force is much larger than Mexico and Venezuela combined also. It's almost 110 million workers, with unemployment rate officially at 6.4%, but unofficial unemployment rate is higher. And Brazil also has a shrinking agricultural sector and an expanding service sector, but the industrial sector is standing still at about 22.2%. So Brazil still has a higher debt to GDP ratio, but not as high as other countries in the north. So their ratio is about 67%, which is not too dangerous. But Brazil has been racked with scandals and abuse of privileges by the Workers' Party, on which there was been a lot of hope. And one would have to say that they are still better than oligarchy, but the recent move against their president, Dilma Rousseff, including impeachment moves, they indicate definite prospects for political instability in Brazil, which of course is a sign of political disability as well. And Brazil also has tremendous problems in terms of income inequality. It is the most unequal society in terms of income and wealth in Latin America, actually in all of the Americas. It has not had meaningful land reform that Workers' Party had promised. It has not had the kind of move away from neoliberal program that Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, or even Chile made in the past when they had progressive regimes. So Brazil is in a lot of trouble, and their energy sector is not doing that well either. So even more than Mexico, I think Brazil would be a barometer of political instability in Latin America. And given that the workers are better organized than in Mexico, although not as organized as in Venezuela, and they have been misled by Workers' Party for a long time, the leaders of the Workers' Party, that is, on whom they had put so much hope and faith. There will be, I think, political opening for alternative political organizations that could, in many instances, work with Workers' Party on local and national issues even. But Workers' Party by itself, unless it changes its program and changes the face of its leadership, will not be able to lead ordinary Brazilian workers and peasants on a path that would be a path of liberation. So a new kind of politics from below in Brazil will have to be invented. but the objective circumstances for such an invention, I think, are more propitious for Brazil than they have been any time in recent past. The very success and victories of the Workers' Party demonstrate that it is possible to build in Brazil truly popular organizations from below and to start mass movements and to even capture power. But to capture power for what is the question. Of all the so-called pink revolutions, Brazilian revolution was the faintest pink. And right from the very beginning, it was compromising with global capitalism, with IMF, with United States, with the European Union, and Brazilian people have paid a high price for this. And the Workers' Party does bear some responsibility for this kind of situation. So the Workers' Party itself, if it can be reformed from below, I think will be able to move in a better direction. But more importantly and more urgently, alternative organizations from below that can work with Workers' Party when they agree on issues and strategies, but will not be sectarian, I think will be much more important in the future of Brazil. Now, our last country, Argentina, last but not the least. Argentina is close to Mexico in terms of its GDP, but has fewer people, so the GDP per capita is higher. Argentina's purchasing power parity GDP is almost 1 trillion, between 965 billion and 1 trillion. But its growth rate has been very anemic, only 0.2% recently. Its per capita income, as I said, is the highest among these 4 countries at 22,400. Its saving rate, however, is low, 15%. And it has also a high rate of inflation at 28%. Its national debt is not as high as Brazil's, and unemployment rate, however, is higher at 8%, and most probably it is over 10%. Its exchange rate also is really overvalued at the official rate. There is an unofficial rate that is also accepted officially, more or less, called the blue exchange rate. So Argentina is an interesting kind of country. Recently there were setbacks also, and I think this setback has occurred mainly because of strategic weaknesses in Kirchner's party and allies. They are definitely not as faintly pink as Brazil, but they have been faint-hearted in many respects since they very boldly defied the IMF. The most encouraging thing about Argentina is that from the crisis of 2001 until now, workers have self-organized themselves a great deal. So in that sense, the self-organization of the masses is a big factor if one looks at Argentinian political history recently from below. But some of them have been co-opted, even the piqueteros have been co-opted. Others have become discouraged. But Argentinian people, I think, still have a lot of militancy left in them. They have learned to organize better. So throughout Latin America, one could say that people actually are better organizers and better organized with potential to be even better organized than they are already. And that is the biggest hope for people in Latin America. They cannot influence geopolitics. Even Brazil cannot do that. They cannot influence US foreign policy. They can, of course, influence US public opinion and opinions of those decent Americans who want to know about the history of their neighbors and who care about social justice and fairness. And there are many North Americans of this description as well. So a policy that is principled in these Latin American countries, guided by people's interests, organized around people's interests, militant without being adventurist. These kind of organizations and policies and politics, these have a good chance to emerge in the next 10 years in Latin America. And to the extent that they do, and they will definitely do unevenly across Latin America, and there are many Latin American countries that we have not discussed for lack of time, but one could expect a great deal more mass militancy, better organization of masses, better political movements and programs from below, with a few of them taking power in the future. But it is fraught with much class conflict and other kinds of conflicts, including some of the deep issues with respect to indigenous people and women. These are, of course, great issues that deserve separate discussion and deeper analysis, which I hope to do in a future talk. Thank you very much.